The Mandalorian Season 3 brings its most intriguing mystery to a close, but it still leaves one question unanswered. Can Force sensitives really be cloned or not? It's revealed in Season 3's finale that Dr. Pershing's research and experiments on Grogu have resulted in Force-sensitive clones of Moff Gideon, the first of their kind and a breakthrough in cloning technology beyond anything that had come out of Kamino.
I was isolating the potential to wield the Force and incorporating it into an unstoppable army.
Theories around cloning Force sensitives have surrounded The Mandalorian since Season 1, and fans have been wondering if this mystery was laying the foundations for Snoke and later Palpatine's return.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
In an interview with Forbes, series co-creator Dave Filoni is quoted as saying that once The Mandalorian Season 3 is over, fans will look back at what's happened and start to put things together in a different way. He also said the story would demonstrate there were much larger things at play. I'm paraphrasing, but watching the series back again, now that we know how Season 3 ends, the clues for Force cloning are definitely all there. Ever since we learned that the client, that Imperial warlord from Season 1, was paying for the Mandalorian to bring Grogu to him for more experimentation, people have speculated that he and Dr. Pershing were attempting to clone Grogu, or that Grogu himself was a clone. Whatever was going on, it was clear that Grogu's Force sensitivity was a crucial part of Pershing's experiments. Dr. Pershing, who, by the way, carries the insignia of the clone scientists from Kamino. In Season 2, Mando discovers several misshapen clones hibernating on the Imperial garrison on Navarro. It appears that Pershing was able to at least attempt to create a clone based on his own experimentation. It also shows us that Moff Gideon was dabbling in a new form of clone technology, one free from Kaminoan control. The clone we get a close-up on was disfigured and resembled Supreme Leader Snoke, and while I don't think it's that intentional anymore, it did spur theories of Force sensitivity and the nature of clones. Since Snoke was revealed to have been grown on Exegol as a pawn for Sidious.
I made Snoke.
But nonetheless an artificial being who was imbued with the Force. So if Pershing was in fact working on the galaxy's first Force-sensitive clone, then why did nobody immediately copy his formula to create functional clones of Palpatine? We know that eventually Palpatine gets things right, and the novelization of The Rise of Skywalker does a lot of heavy lifting here, but it also shows there was plenty of trial and error in resurrecting Palpatine in the clone body. Check out this excerpt from the novelization. Using a technique known as strand casting, countless modified clone bodies were produced from my genetic template, says Palpatine. All but one of them were utter failures. The lone survivor of the cloning process lacked any connection to the Force. Now we know this failed clone takes the name Dathan and escapes Exegol thanks to Shadows of the Sith, a novel by Adam Christopher. But if Palpatine couldn't create a Force-sensitive clone 30 years after Gideon, then we need to understand why. Back to The Mandalorian now, and Chapter 23 adds more to the clone conspiracy and why we may never know the real results of Gideon's Force cloning project. Turns out that while Grogu was being harvested for his Force sensitivity, the other half of the template was to be filled in by Moff Gideon himself, in a vain attempt to create the perfect being. Gideon saw that as a combination of himself, capable of wielding the Force and protected by Mandalorian Beskar. In Gideon's war room beneath the surface of Mandalore, the Imperial Shadow Council would meet to discuss their return. In the days before his death, Gideon asserted himself as the rightful leader of the Imperial Remnant, saying he had no desire in waiting around for either Grand Admiral Thrawn or anything like a resurgent Emperor to lead them to victory. It's at this same meeting that Commandant Brendol Hux accuses Gideon of hoarding clone technology by keeping Dr. Pershing and his scientific breakthroughs on cloning to himself.
What has become of Dr. Pershing and the research you promised us? You held Pershing and were attempting your own experiments on Navarro.
Even though Hux is correct, Gideon denies it, proving that this whole cloning initiative is happening off the radar of Imperial leadership. Brendol Hux, by the way, is a member of the Imperial sect which would eventually form the First Order and father of General Armitage Hux.
I'm the spy.
Seeing as he's still uninformed of the Doctor's breakthrough at the time of the facility's destruction, it would appear that Dr. Pershing's Force clone technique has been lost to the First Order and the galaxy at large. The brains behind the operation, Dr. Pershing, had his mind wiped by the New Republic's Mind Flayer.
Wait, this is a Mind Flayer.
Before he had the chance to share his findings in detail with them. Din Djarin overloaded the vats containing viable clones on Mandalore, Before that, he destroyed what we can assume were the first attempts at Force clones when they took out the Navarro facility in Season 2. And finally, Gideon himself was destroyed when he burnt to death on Mandalore, along with the cloning facility underneath the planet's surface. But if these things hadn't been destroyed, do we even know if Gideon's clones were a success? For all we know, these Force clones were perfectly healthy, but unable to wield the Force. But remember, Dave also mentioned in that interview that perhaps we would start to see there were some things larger that were in play. I believe he's referring to Palpatine's eventual use of clone technology. When Palpatine's consciousness was placed inside one of these clone bodies, it would deteriorate rapidly, and he wound up looking like he did in The Rise of Skywalker, all because of the strain that the Force, perhaps the dark side, put on the artificial clone frame. What was it that led Palpatine to successfully wield the Force in a clone body? Was it ancient Sith ritual or technology? Or was it just that his template was already Force sensitive and therefore had a chance of sustaining the Force, even if only for a short time? And if that is the case, then what about Snoke? Well, let's just consider this for a moment. While Gideon, his clones, the cloning facilities on both Navarro and Mandalore were destroyed, as well as Pershing and his research being lost to the New Republic's Mind Flayer, the Doctor was still allowed to present a small part of his research on Coruscant. With no specific mention of the Force, Dr. Pershing told his audience that splicing the DNA of two templates to create one hybrid clone was possible.
Can duplicate an individual from a single genetic strand.
Snoke is the first successful Force-sensitive clone we have seen in the timeline so far, and he is referred to as a strand cast, a very particular type of cloning in The Rise of Skywalker's novelization. Anyone paying particular attention to the scene following Pershing's presentation would have seen this little conversation taking place. Let's listen carefully to what Pershing is discussing.
It's quite fascinating, actually. The first casts rejected the formula almost immediately.
Hello, Doctor.
But
it must be wonderful now that you work with a government that appreciates your contribution, no?
Pershing is potentially referring to the clones we first saw on Navarro, the first batch of clones created before growing another batch for Gideon on Mandalore. The Mandalore clones were far more advanced than the Navarro batch, but whether or not they would be fully functional like Snoke, we'll never know. I think the destruction of the Mandalore facility and erasure of Pershing's research was a major setback, but not an absolute dead end in the search for Force clone technology. I think those loyal to Palpatine were able to take what little information remained of Gideon's success and were on the cusp of rediscovering what Dr. Pershing had already perfected decades ago by the time of The Rise of Skywalker. So back again to that Forbes interview, I think the clone mystery did have a definitive ending in The Mandalorian. All traces of it go up in smoke. And the idea of something larger refers to the future Force cloning attempts, which succeed in either Snoke or Palpatine's arrival. Sub to Sublight if you haven't already, and thank you so much for watching. And hey, clone body or not, I'm here to tell you that the Force will be with you. Always.